You know, I've enjoyed the class so far talking about all the things that we fear, things that we have to improve on, things we have to work on to be better evangelists, and also that it's a team effort, right? I think a lot of what we'll talk about tonight, how we can help each other, work together. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot too in relation to this lesson is how a lot of times for me, I think we probably all struggle with this, is evangelism can feel like it's for someone else, right? The term that comes to mind, I heard this when I was in college, and I was always fascinated by this phrase, the diffusion of responsibility. Have you guys ever heard that? Are you familiar with the term diffusion of responsibility? What does that sound like? It's a real phenomenon that exists. The study that they presented to us was someone was assaulted in New York City, and there was like 100 and something witnesses, and no one called the police. And they interviewed like 100 something people, and guess what they all said? They all witnessed this crime. What did they all say? Well, they mostly said, I thought someone else would call the police. I thought someone else would call. Or you've driven by that person with a flat tire, and you're like, surely someone else will stop, right? We've probably been there. We sometimes have that with evangelism. We're like, somebody else probably will talk to them, or somebody else is better suited than I am. And so as we consider the challenge and the hesitations that we often have, I've really enjoyed going over those, trying to improve on those. We often feel when we're sharing our faith, it's important to, I think, look at Jesus as such the ultimate example, we could say. And he demonstrates through his actions what it means to reach out intentionally. Okay, we use that term a lot, kind of catchy, but we're going to mention that a few more times tonight, what it means to be intentional. But he came with a clear mission. What was his mission? What was Jesus' mission? Seek and save the lost. That's right. And so by, I think, observing how Jesus engaged with people, as we're going to look here in John chapter 4, we can learn some practical steps for making that our mission and overcome the tendency to maybe leave the responsibility to somebody else, as sometimes we might often be tempted to do. So we're going to start here in John chapter 4, verse 7. Before we do, Dad, would you lead us in a prayer before we begin? Amen. Thank you. Okay, so picking up in John chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 7, but just a few quick things of kind of what's going on here. Jesus is going to Galilee, and it says in verse 4 that he had to pass through Samaria, okay? So there's some things, if you're not familiar with the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans, it was not good, right? Historically, there was a lot of things that had went on there, a lot of backstory of how they viewed each other. They did not get along. And I was reading about how a lot of times Jews would intentionally go around, out of their way, take longer trips to not have to interact with Samaritans sometimes. That was not uncommon. But Jesus obviously had something in mind. He has a clear mission here because he says he had to pass through Samaria. And so he comes to this well. He sits down, and then one other thing that kind of just to key in on, we're going to mention this later on, but is just his physical state. So he's thirsty. It says he is weary from his journey, it says here in verse 6, and so he's sitting down at this well. So we'll start there. Let's start in verse 7, and it's kind of a lengthy reading, but we'll read to about verse 30. Then came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. Therefore the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask me for a drink, since I am a Samaritan woman?" For the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said to her, "If you knew the gift of God, and who it is who says to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." She said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where then do you get that living water? You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you, who gave us this well and drank of it himself and his sons and his cattle? Jesus answered and said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him shall never thirst. But the water I will give him will become in him a well of water springing up to eternal life. Verse 15, the woman said to him, Sir, give me this water so I will not be thirsty nor come all the way here to draw. He said to her, Go call your husband and come here. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said to her, You have correctly said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you have now is not your husband. This you have said truly. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in the mountain, and you people say that it is in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. But Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know, and we worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When that one comes, he will declare all things to us. Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he. At this point, his disciples came, and they were amazed that he had been speaking with a woman, yet no one said, What do you seek, or where do you speak with her? So the woman left her water pot, went into the city, and said to the men, Come and see the man who told me all the things I have done. This is not the Christ, is it? They went out of the city and were coming to him. So kind of a lengthy read, but if you haven't read that account in a while, it's good to go over before we make some points from it. One of the first things I want to get right into is the fact that Jesus initiates the conversation, right? Seems simple, but isn't that is the first hurdle to overcome, right? When we want to talk to somebody about religious things, is initiating the conversation. He doesn't hit her with something overly profound at first. He just starts off with asking for a drink, and then immediately leads into something that intrigues her, you see, which again, she's not going to know everything in the end when she goes to call other people to come, but she's intrigued enough to come in to hear more. And so, like I said, sometimes initiating the conversation is the hardest part. And if you've ever walked away saying, I wish I would have said something. Have you ever been there? Or you thought, man, I had a perfect opportunity to bring something up and I didn't say it, right? We probably all had those kind of regrets. And those are going to happen from time to time. We just don't think in the moment. But again, being intentional, looking for those opportunities are things that will really help us. And just the fact that a simple religious comment can open the door sometimes, right? Have you ever been there? It's like somebody says one thing and you're like, well, actually it's this. And then you start talking to them about religious things. So sometimes we might think that it has to be this big grandiose thing, that we have to set up this really in-depth study, when sometimes it's just initiating the conversation, just getting conversation started is the first hurdle to overcome, but that is probably the most important, because it won't go anywhere without that. And the fact that he starts this conversation at all look at all the barriers that he has to the communication with this woman, okay? What 3 strikes did she have against her? Devin used strikes, okay? So those weren't my terms, but not strikes we would perceive today, but as far as between a Jew and a Samaritan woman, what would be the 3 strikes against this woman in the eyes of culturally maybe? Okay. Yep, sexually immoral, exactly. What else? She was a woman. Okay. And she was a Samaritan. And I was reading about, just from culturally how rabbis would interact with women, that it was, even culturally, rabbis wouldn't go to an inn, like a hotel we would think of, right, without his wife, even if he was with his daughter or his sister. They didn't want to be perceived as being seen with a woman that is not their wife. So the rules were very strict. You see when his disciples come back, they're already like, they already think this is strange that he's talking to this woman. She thinks it's strange, right? That's one of the first things she asks him. So every cultural, religious, moral barrier existed between them, right? But did it stop him from initiating the conversation? Okay, definitely did not. So think just for yourself, what's stopping you, right? We think all these excuses that maybe barriers that we have in between, but what's stopping me, right, from starting these conversations? Because we still have somebody we might think of as a three-strike person, right? What are the people today we think of three-strike people? Don't have to be specific. Don't say Republican or Democrat, but just in general, what are the three strikes we think of? That's right. Politics. We think, I don't have anything in common with them. What else?
Well, we don't know anything about them, but like previous marriages.
Lifestyle.
Hard for me to
Yep.
talk about somebody.
Yeah. Religion. I was going to say, when we were talking a few weeks ago about, I can't remember, we were talking about fears or whatever, things we're afraid to ask. And I don't know that I mentioned this, but one of the things I always fear is preconceived notions, right? We think, man, they know where I go to church. They're already got their mind made up. And then I started thinking, well, I'm doing that. Because I'm thinking, well, I know where they go to, like, they're not going to believe what I have to say. I know where they go to church, right? I'm guilty of that. So sometimes just having these ideas already in our head, we've got them figured out. We know they're going to say, that's not the case. There are people who are just waiting for somebody to bring something up, right? They're just hoping for an opportunity of somebody to talk to them. And so we'll talk about this here in a minute too, but just reframing how we view other people is a big part of this, right? How do we perceive other people? Do we see them, as Jesus is going to mention here in just a moment? At the end, we'll read that the fields are white, right? That there's so many opportunities out there, but we a lot of times avoid the very people that Jesus would go towards, right? He had a knack for that. And also, just focusing on the things we don't have in common will keep us from approaching people, won't it? Anybody struggle with pessimism? Has anybody described themselves here? Not a very sheepish finger up. I try not to say that, yeah. But I think I'm a realist, or like I'm very pragmatic. But you can teeter on the edge of being pessimistic, right? And with that, we might view other people that way. Well, what could I say? What can I do? There's nothing I could say to them to help them. So what we really can do that can help we struggle with that is look at what we should be doing, which is focusing on what we have in common. There's so many people in the religious world that there may be a ton of things we agree on. There's an all-powerful creator, that his only son was Jesus, right? That the Bible is his irrefutable word. We can start on some of those things and build a foundation and not just have to go straight into the things that we disagree on and build rapport. There's a lot of this that has tact, and you've probably all been there, right? You have to have a little bit of tact, or a lot of, when you're studying with different people. And so with this woman, we can maybe even translate to every person. What do we have in common? What would they have in common? The Jews have in common with the Samaritans, or what would we have in common with this woman, or people in general today, we could say? Think about how we're created. Are we all made in God's image? Yeah. What else?
We all hunger and thirst.
Okay. We all need the truth. We all need grace, right? We all have sinned. Okay. And we're all wanted by God. He wants that all people should be saved. Again, if we're viewing every potential person we're studying with as someone who is made in God's image, that they need the truth, that God wants them to be saved, then we're not going to care about what their politics are or what their background may have been, or where they've been or whatever, like things like that. But it starts with, I think evangelism starts with seeing people correctly, right? That it is somebody we could potentially save. Paul so beautifully mentions that too. We just got through studying 1 Corinthians, and becoming all things to all men, so he might win others, right? You think of all the work that he did. There's other things we kind of know about her, just to kind of throw in here quickly before we move on, but that we can relate to is she had some religious inclinations, right? A lot of people where we live here in Oklahoma, probably very rarely we're going to meet somebody who practices witchcraft or is like Wiccan or whatever, right? Most people, they go to church somewhere, right? So again, there may be some who have religious inclinations. She believes some things correctly, right? What did she have that was correct? Some things she was saying. She knew the Messiah was coming, and that, obviously it would seem like she was open to it being possibly this person she's talking to, because she runs into the city, right? She wasn't trying to refute that. She thought he was a prophet, right? By the fact that he figured these things out, she perceived him as some sort of prophet. But then she got some things wrong, right? Which is kind of interesting. We'll talk about it here in the next point, but she brings up some things automatically, to try to kind of maybe start an argument or just highlight their differences. But okay, so let's move into some, when we talk about the do's and don'ts, some of the things Jesus doesn't do. We'll start with those first. So what he doesn't do, we've already kind of made this point, it's I think maybe last week or the week before, is he doesn't address everything all at once, right? That may not be a struggle for everybody. Sometimes we feel, I'm a classic over-explainer, so I feel like I have to, I got to tell them everything. They're not going to understand this unless I tell them everything, right? So not having to tell them everything at once, he doesn't do that, right? He doesn't have to explain everything to her. Also, he doesn't ignore sin. We talked about some of our biggest fears. That's one of them, right? Oh man, like when they bring up something or they're asking if this is wrong, we think, oh man, how are we going to handle this? But he doesn't ignore it. But also just not giving up on her, right? When he already knew everything about her. But the lesson we can get from that too, as these things are kind of being known to us as we're reading it in chapter 4, is he doesn't say, well, there's no way you're going to be saved. Now I found out everything about you. Doesn't give up on the person. And even when she tries to interject here, which I think is kind of interesting, that when he's in verse 21, when they talk about where you should worship and where you shouldn't, is that she tries to bring up this discrepancy that they have, right? This contention that they have. And a lot of people might do that. If they're backed into a corner, they might, they bring up something that they know that we may not agree on to try to sidetrack or change the subject like she does. She starts bringing up the fact that, well, you Jews say you should worship here, and we say we should worship here, bringing up the differences. But Jesus isn't frustrated by that. He's willing to discuss the issue also, but he doesn't give up on her, and he doesn't give up on the process. Where we stopped reading in 30, let's jump down and read 32 through 32, and then we'll read 34 through 38. So in 32, let's actually just read 34 through 38 here. So Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look on the fields, that they are white for harvest. Already he who reaps is receiving wages and is gathering fruit for life eternal, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. For in the case, the saying is true, one sows, another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. So Jesus knew that the process, that even if we get frustrated by the person we're talking to, inevitably we're going to talk to somebody and it's not going to go well, right? Maybe you've already been there. It did not go well. Can that get you down where you're like, I'm not studying with anybody ever again, right? You can feel that way maybe. If it goes really bad, not giving up on the process is the best way to not give up completely, right? To not get frustrated. Same for us as Christians. Something I always say is keeping our eye on heaven is what keeps us from the frustrations of daily things, right? The mundaneness or when we stumble. We got to be focused on the most important thing, which is the process, right? And there will be times we fail or things that don't go well, but we have to keep moving. So Jesus in this, you see, he's patient, he's focused, he's intentional, right? And so when we think about some things not to do, we've already mentioned some of those in our past class, but what are some mistakes we tend to make the most? If we look at just the ones here, like we've mentioned with Jesus, overloading people, right? We might do that. Or avoiding hard topics, giving up too quickly. Probably giving up too quickly is pretty common, right? We get frustrated and we're like, oh man. But what else? Anything else mistakes we make?
He didn't shame her when you talk about customs.
Yeah.
He knew the truth. He was very straightforward.
Didn't tiptoe around it.
Right, but
Yeah.
he did not shame her.
Yeah.
And sometimes, sometimes I don't want to say we, but look down on somebody because you know something they've done or
Yeah.
like they've done.
And people will automatically pick up on your tone, or if you're being condescending or arrogant, like people will see, right? They'll tune you out. And every person's different. Yes, we don't want to tiptoe around those things, but again, in having tact, there's some people who they just want you to tell them bluntly and plainly, right? And some are like in a very broken state, right? Maybe they're like teetering on the edge. So how we do that, bringing it up, not being afraid of it, but how we address it too, just depends on the individual person. Misty.
The Bible just talks about that people believed and then they were baptized. And so if we can get past all the other looking so far ahead and just think if I can just get them to believe,
Yeah.
and that belief will hopefully produce those other things.
Yeah.
And so if you can just think about getting just to that point and then go from there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've thought a lot through this of, man, we overthink this so many times, right? We really overthink it. But let's look at some of the things that he does do here as we kind of move on to, first, he's willing to be inconvenienced, okay? So he had to go through Samaria. Like I said, it might have been the shorter route, but it was very common for them to not want to go through and interact with the Samaritans, oftentimes. It's a very common thing. So he's willing to be inconvenienced, willing to talk to somebody who is being perceived as undesirable also, right? And what I have a lot of respect for is he's focused on spiritual things even though he's tired, he's thirsty, and he's hungry. Because we're going to see here at the end when they were trying to, we mentioned here, that was the one we didn't read, but in verse 32, or right before that, they were, in verse 31, his disciples were urging him saying, "Rabbi, eat." They had went to find food. So he implies he hadn't ate, he's sitting down tired, he's thirsty, he's asking for water. Because if you are ever hangry, or is anybody the hangry type, right? We just got through 10 Deuteronomy. They're probably tired of me bringing up the food thing, but I thought it was just so funny. Every time they complained, it was like, well, we had melons and garlic back when we were slaves. It was like they were willing to go back into slavery. And it was always when they were hungry, they would get tired, you get a little hungry, and you think, I'm not messing with this. I don't have time to talk to this person. Think about the fact that Jesus was all those things, and he still had the time to be focused on spiritual things, and again, seeing the opportunity here with this woman.
He sets aside all of the man-made rules that the Jews had.
Yeah.
Under their rules, he couldn't talk to her.
Yeah, to the well all alone, as a woman to draw water by herself would be kind of unusual. So the fact that she's out there, by herself, maybe a lot of people don't, already has kind of been like an outcast. And Jesus is still willing to talk to her. So many things that he's doing kind of outside the norm here.
Asking her a favor was the thing that kind of broke the ice, and that, I'm willing to ask you for a favor.
Yeah.
And sometimes that can,
Build rapport.
stir up a
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, so many of these things too are just being what Christians should be, right? If we're kind, patient, loving, we're trying to help others, those conversations will come up a lot easier too if we're just already doing what we're commanded to do. So some of these things shouldn't be brand new ideas. But I just want to make the point too, and we're going to see this really clearly when we talk about, we already read this part, but what she goes and does, okay? That she just goes and tells other people, right? Evangelism isn't always about skill, it's about availability and intention, okay? So think about that for a minute. Can you be the most knowledgeable, like you're a Bible scholar, or maybe you knew somebody like this, but they're still terrible at talking to other people or evangelizing? Is that possible? Yes. Sometimes maybe it's because you're arrogant. If somebody knows everything about a certain subject, right, and you're brand new to it, and it can just be like a bore to them, right? That could be a struggle for some. Or you're super knowledgeable. Maybe you know everything about the Bible, but you hide your knowledge. Maybe you don't like to talk to people or whatever it may be. So doesn't mean we don't have to have Bible knowledge. Don't get me wrong. But again, like we were talking about when Misty made her comment, sometimes we overthink what we need to know to be able to talk to people. We don't want to teach them incorrectly. Devin has mentioned several times saying, I don't know. let's figure it out together, or we can have a study, right? So if you know that's the safety valve, saying, I don't know, let's find out. And people like that. When you double down or you're talking about something you clearly don't know about, people can see through that, can't they? Like we can, right? Instead of saying, I don't know. That's the best thing when you're studying with somebody and they're like, I don't know. Can we look? You're like, yeah, let's look. We need to be like that too, right? If we don't know. So just keep that in the back of your mind.
It's kind of interesting that she is almost making fun of him. What, you being a Jew asked me for a drink?
Yeah.
Look at this crazy situation we're in here,
Yeah.
Whatever, he doesn't let that faze him at all. Or
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Better water than I got. Look at this well. I got all this great water.
Yeah, I was reading about how that was that word is translated, and it's kind of like a snarky comment. What she says, like, you being a Jew are asking me for you're asking me for a drink, and so yeah, he doesn't let that stop him though. So just think about this for a minute, just an open-ended question, just to take home with you. I'll have a few of these for you, but think about when was the last time you turned a normal conversation spiritual? Not with your kids or your husband or wife, but somebody about the Bible. Think about it. If you can't think of when that was, I was trying to think, when was that? Somebody that I've talked to. It might be awkward at first, right? But it is something that can get easier. Okay, let's look at now what the result of this was. So we see what she did. What came about because of this interaction is the coolest part of this chapter. That she immediately went to other people and told them. She didn't know very much at all, right? Only what had happened, but she knew enough to invite other people. She didn't ask the question, well, how effective could I really be? I'm a shunned Samaritan woman. But this shunned Samaritan woman brought many of the Samaritans of the city to Jesus. So let's read 39 through 42. Heard for ourselves now and know that this one is indeed the Savior of the world. So again, like Missy mentioned, just getting them to believe, right? Just getting them to come see for themselves, to open the Word, to come hear a sermon, to go to a study, right? Then the same thing will happen. They're going to go from just taking your word for it to this is what's in God's Word, okay? So again, when we say we overthink it, we're putting too much of it on ourselves and not enough of it on what this is able to do, right? This is what will convict. This is what will save them. We put too much on ourselves sometime and thinking we have to do everything, say everything, right? So again, you don't have to know everything. Sometimes it's just, I think of personal experience, not that we do not need God's Word, but when you're just maybe starting out, this is something I'd always tell my high school classes when they're trying to talk to their friends. I said, can you at least tell them why you decided to become a Christian? You should at the very least be able to tell them that. Tell them why you became a Christian and have passages for it, but just say, well, this is why I believed. People today use the word, I think, testimony, right? Probably incorrectly sometimes. But just doing that, right? Telling them why you believed, why it was important to you, because people can get excited about that if they hear the excitement that you're giving them of why you decided to follow Christ. And I was thinking, what are all the things we do that we're excited about, that we're happy to tell people about, right? I'm in people's houses every day doing appraisals, right? The people aren't always there, but if I see like deer heads or they have guitars, it's no problem. Like, you're just excited to talk to them about this hobby that you have. Well, are we as excited to talk about Jesus as we are our hobbies, that are just silly things, right? Because when somebody else you see, oh man, they might have this one thing in common with me, we get excited, right? Well, what about the most important thing, which is if they're interested in Jesus? So just being excited to tell people about that. And just thinking, you could just be the person who invites. What if that's your only thing? If you're like, man, I'm good at inviting people, that's all you do, just inviting them can be a very powerful thing. I was thinking maybe because the playoffs are going on right now, but does everybody remember, well, probably not everybody, John Stockton? He played in the NBA when I was in probably high school age. What's he most famous for? Does anybody remember what John Stockton was famous for? Assists, right? He has the most assists by a long shot. It's like 15,000 assists, right? What's implied by an assist? What's the end result of the assist? That a point is made, right? You making a pass is just a pass, right? An assist is that you pass the ball and then we got a point. And so he holds that record by a huge spread. But what's even more interesting is he wasn't a big scorer. He averaged like 13 points per game. So he didn't score a lot. But think how many points were scored because he got the ball in the right person's hands, who was most suited to shoot. And when he would be interviewed, he would talk about his goal was playmaking, being efficient, running the offense. His main goal was not always scoring, he said. Not a lot of people think that way, professional athletes, right? But he was looking for opportunities to get the ball to the person who is in the best position to score, right? And think about it, we could be the John Stockton of evangelism, right? That we just invite and get them to a study, invite them, get them to church, invite them and get them to open the Bible. That sounds easy. I know that can be a little harder than it sounds, but just being the person who makes an assist, is a powerful thing. So looking for opportunities is the best way, I think, probably to handle that. Okay, then we'll kind of finish up here with looking at some practical takeaways that we might have. We've already kind of mentioned this too, but having knowledge and thinking that you have to say everything, that's a big one, right? That maybe a lot of us struggle with, that we think, oh, I've got so many things. I've got to address marriage and divorce, and I got to talk to them about salvation. I got to talk to them about this. Just kind of getting that out of our head and thinking, okay, we just need them to believe, or we just need to get them to open the Bible, or to talk to them, some very basic things. Devin had this in his outline that he gave me. He gave me a few notes. So I don't know if he wrote this or not, but I like this. You don't have to tell someone everything. You just have to tell them something about the someone. Okay, capital S, someone, right? So don't tell them everything. Just tell them something about Jesus, right? And you would be shocked too, maybe you've been there, probably a lot of you have, how a lot of people are waiting to talk about religious things, right? Now, I've also been in people's houses where you're like, I don't think I can bring anything up here. Like, I remember a guy had a whiteboard with all this like stuff written in Hebrew, and I kind of read it briefly, and I was like, I don't think this is gonna, probably be the can of worms I can open. But sometimes we don't realize how many people are to be asked or to talk about spiritual things. And then looking for opportunities. That's probably, I think sometimes we get so busy, right, that we're not looking for opportunities, right? And the thing always comes to mind is like when you get a new car. Do you ever have that phenomenon? You get a new car and then you see it everywhere. There's like 10 of them in the Walmart parking lot, and you never saw before. Why is that? You're paying attention. You're like, you see the thing right now. You're like, oh man. You're like, all these people have good taste like me. But when we try to reframe our mind that every situation we might think of, how could I bring this up, right? Now, we got to be careful sometimes of forcing it or coming off annoying. Again, there's always tact involved. But if we're not looking for an opportunity, once we do, then they're just going to pop up everywhere, right? In places we may not expect them. John?
Well, like Paul had knowledge, but he knew who exactly to take with him to reach the most where he went. Like he changed. Like, okay, I need him to go with me through this journey.
Yeah.
If
Yep.
you know who has things in common with other people, even though you might not, take somebody that might.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate the sales analogy like to evangelism, but that if you ever go to a car dealership, sometimes they'll switch the salesman who they think is like, looks like you or like dresses like you. They're trying to like get some sort of connection. But the principle there is not wrong, especially maybe if you're a guy and it's a lady at work who's asking you questions and you think, man, they have so much in common with this person, like you. We were, not too long ago, one of our mentors, we were talking about, in our appraisal class, was talking about ways to give. And he was talking about the power of introductions. Like, that can be valuable, right? You introduce somebody like, hey, you need to meet my friend, right, for like a business connection. But I was thinking, man, from a spiritual connection, like introducing somebody to the right person can be super valuable, right? just getting the right people connected. So, there's a lot to that. And then just thinking too, everyone has a role, right? Sometimes we can get that in our head of like, well, there's nothing I can do, or I'm not the right person. I'm not good at talking to people. There's other people out there just like you, right, who have the same kind of personalities and tendencies and stuff like that. So as Jesus, he mentions here in verse 37 and 38, talking about some plant, some water, right? Everybody has a different role. And some people are really good at one thing, which again, just I think maybe kind of has really made me think a lot more about how this is a team effort for this congregation, right? That if we're working together, it doesn't make it as scary, right? We think, hey, how can we help each other? Or telling them like, hey, I got somebody I'm really wanting to talk to. What do you guys think, right? Asking for some help or feedback. Working together, we all have a role in that. And then we've talked about this too, but just praying for opportunities. Are we praying that we meet somebody and that we have a conversation, that something will happen, that we can talk to somebody about spiritual things? Something I have to consider and think about a lot more too. And just getting people to Jesus. Look in verse 41. It said, many more people believed because of his word. Okay. So again, it's that whole concept of just getting them to this is what we're trying to do, right? And just being patient. Sometimes it can depend on what kind of personality you have. It may take someone a year or two. Some people it's like a week and they're like, oh man, I know what I need to do. So just not giving up on the person, being patient, and just getting them to his word. So just kind of a quick challenge here, and then I have kind of something here at the end I want to maybe spend a little bit of time talking about here as we kind of wrap up. But this week, just think about one person, challenge you, one person that you could talk to this week. Or maybe that person, I'm thinking of someone who I think I need to call them, or this is the person I know I need to talk to. So this challenge goes out for me, for all you guys too. Who's the one person you could talk to this week to start one conversation, ask one spiritual question, share one thing about Jesus? Think small. We've talked about this in our high school class when it comes to growth, right? Whenever people some people, they're like, well, I'm going to start exercising, right? And they go run 10 miles and they blow their legs out, right? It's that, start with walking, right? And spiritual things too, sometimes it's okay to start small. Now, if you have something glaring you need to take care of, that's maybe different. But if you're trying to improve, start with something small and build on that. Just focus on maybe one thing you can do this week to talk to somebody that could help to get them to his word, as we read here in verse 41. Anybody, any thoughts, questions before we kind of move to this last little section that we have?
I used to go to Bible study with Brother Beauchart when he was in El Reno. And the first thing he did in a Bible study was to say, can we observe conversation reciprocity?
Yeah.
So a lot of people didn't know what that meant, so he explained it to them. He said, now when you're talking, I won't interrupt you.
Yeah.
And when I'm talking, then I would, if you would be, let me finish talking without interruption.
Yeah.
And it worked. It just worked for this thing.
Yeah.
Instead of getting into a battle between who, this and that and so on and so forth, it really worked very well the way he did that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Being a good listener is big time, this kind of stuff, right? Because sometimes we're just thinking of the next thing to try to correct them or maybe talk over them. People are not receptive to that, or we're not receptive to that, right? When somebody's talking over you or there's waiting to correct you, you're like, oh man, how quickly can I get out of this conversation is usually what we're thinking, right? But what I kind of wanted to finish with here, this is something I've been wanting to kind of ask, and I'm hoping that, because I did not prepare this, so I'm hoping that this is why I saved it for the end. But we talk about all the biblical knowledge that we need to have, and I don't want to disconnect that. But there's so many people here in this congregation who were converted. Somebody studied with them. And so I think when we're talking about tact, practical things that can have a huge impact on people, is thinking about, for those of you in here tonight who were converted, was there something, no, I'm saying outside of the Bible, that somebody did, the way they spoke to you, the way they interacted with you, the personality they had that was very impactful on you? Is there anybody in here that would want to share that?
Sorry, I lost my voice, but I remember when me and Stevie were studying, he never got emotional about it. It was just, and
Oh, that's
Devin
good.
talked about, huh?
That's good. Yeah.
And Devin talked about it the other day, was asking them questions. And I remember like my first study, I was like, oh, I'm gonna get him, like I'm gonna prove him wrong. And he just asked me questions like, well, why do you believe? You know, I'm like, well, we can use instruments, you know. And he was like, well, why do you think that? Why do you think you can't?
Yeah.
You know, or why do you think you don't need to be baptized to be saved? And I remember reading 1 Peter 3:21, and I was just like, I couldn't argue it, and I just kept playing in my mind, and that's when I was like, I've got to be baptized. Like, how can you argue with that?
Yeah.
You know, and I don't know, both of those things were like key for me.
Those are great. Those are the exact kind of things I was looking for. If you didn't hear, not being emotional, asking questions. I have told people the things that have tripped me up the most are that. They're like, well, why do you believe that? I'm like, well, now you got to stand on your faith and be like, let me show you. So yeah, asking questions, big time, powerful. Anybody, anything else? Those of you? Or maybe those who, go ahead, Larry.
In verse 25, Jesus, without performing another miracle, picked up that this woman he was talking to knew something about the Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
So he built upon that and said, I am he.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the fact that she knew who that was, was very, very important.
And he did it without asking her probing questions like people do in sales to identify a need. He did it by seeing what she talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Not taking the conversation where you want it to go. I mean, yeah, sometimes we are kind of maybe trying to guide it, but just, excuse me, a lot of that just goes back to listening, right? Being a good listener and seeing what they're saying to try to answer that. Okay, we got about a minute left. Anybody, anything else?
I was just going to add to Wendy's point about being asked questions through the process. You and I talked about this a couple weeks ago, but when we read through the Gospels, I think Jesus has asked somewhere around like 200 questions through the Gospels, and he responds about 75% of the time with more questions for them in answering those questions. So it's clearly such an effective way to get people to reflect on what you're talking about.
Yeah.
By getting them to be, to think about it themselves.
Mhm.
Why do I believe this? Or by asking further questions, it continues to allow them to realize things for themselves without us, fire hydrating it after.
Yeah. Yeah, and if the conversation is trying to get like emotional or it's getting, like you feel like it's getting heated, asking questions again just kind of, directs it back to them. So, yeah, really good points. Okay, I think that was our last bell. Thank you guys for all your comments and for being good listeners, and